All right. So I'll admit, as a psychologist, intimate relationships and attraction and stuff is one of my favorite topics, mainly because there's been shifts that we've seen in because of the advances of neuroscience and social neuroscience, and it's really forced us to take a different look at what intimate love is and what is attraction. Because what we have found, and we're going to actually watch a video on this, is that if you think that love and intimacy is just an emotion, it's just something you have and that's something you can control, you're going to be surprised over the next 2 weeks. Because what's coming out of the neuroscience field and social neuroscience is that the areas of the brain that control intimate love, the reason why we care for each other, why we want to have someone in our life, the area of the brain that is associated with that is not the emotional areas. It's not the amygdala, which is one of the major centers of emotions. It's not the hippocampus area, which is associated with emotions and memory. No, rather, what is associated with intimate love, finding a life partner. It's actually associated with areas within the brainstem and what's called it's kind of the limbic system that is between the cortex and your limbic system. I apologize, I forget the name of it right at the moment. But these areas of the brain, the other thing that they are associated with is keeping our heart going, keeping our lungs going. It's the area of the brain that tells us when we're hungry. It's the area of the brain that tells us when we're thirsty. It's all that automatic areas of the brain, those things we don't need to think about. And I want you to think about that. If that is the area that intimate love is firing and going crazy, when we're thinking about our love objects, when we're thinking about those people we want to be with, this makes love not an emotion, not a desire. It makes love a human basic drive, the same exact drive that drives us to eat, drink, breathe, and our heart keeps pumping. And I think that's kind of cool because it tells us a lot about the human condition, why it is we go so crazy when we lose love. Well, if you think about it, when we lose love, we go through the same things that we go through when we don't have access to food or water. We go and try and sometimes violently try to get it back. We become jealous of people who have it and we don't. Okay. It also explains why, when we're in the thralls of it, we want more of it and we desire it. Okay. And so the thing that I want you to think about over the next 2 weeks is this adjustment in thinking about what having that special life partner in your life really is. Because it is just like food and water and breathing and heart beatings, okay? But I want to play a video that I think better describes it than I do. And it's by Helen Fisher, who is one of the eminent scientists who look into intimacy and into love. And she does a really good introductory kind of video for us as afterwards we'll start talking about the attraction process. And then we'll start talking about why people fall in love in the first place. What is it that we desire, those types of things. And we'll end with next week talking about family, but we'll also talk about there are people who can have love for 30, 40, 50 years. And we'll talk about what is that and what makes them a little bit more unique than the rest of us who can't have that, okay? But I want to start with this video. I'm going to pause the recording because it is copywritten. So I'm going to pause our recording to play the video. What Dr. Fisher was talking about with the chemistry.com experiment is yes, indeed, sometimes we there is an attraction towards different types of personality types, but ultimately there's no consistent pattern that has been found yet. So just to kind of emphasize those 2 points. So with that being said, let's get into the content of what we have tonight. Okay. All right, so as I said, we're going to talk about attraction and mate selection, but let's again give a common definition so we're all on the same page about what we mean by attraction. Okay. Susan Fiske, who is one of the more intimate, more famous social psychologists, once said, attraction impels one person to seek another, and attraction can change lives. And I think that that's an important point, that whenever we're compelled towards someone, it's going to change us in some way. But when we define attraction, let's just all agree that when we're talking about attraction, it's a concerns a desire for voluntary relationship, sustained because participants enjoy each other. So during these conversations, we may hit it a little bit next week when we talk about marriage and family, about things like arranged marriages, things like forced relationships and those types of issues. And we'll talk about the difference between what that is versus what this is when we're talking about a voluntary want for someone else, a voluntary desire for someone else. Okay. And operationally, we need to think of this in 3 specific areas: the affective, cognitive, and behavioral areas. Primary affect is just a simple evaluation of liking or not liking another person. It's just saying, no, yes. And I think, I hope anyways, because I hope I'm not the only weirdo in the room, I think there's people in the world that we're attracted to instantly, and there's people who kind of repel us instantly. So I know there's people, and it has to do with the affect, how it makes you feel around them. So I know that there's individuals in my life that I just cringe when I hear I have to meet with them. And there's no specific reason why. They're perfectly decent people. They have lots of friends. They're good colleagues, but for some reason, it's just kind of not my thing. This is what we're talking about. Primary affect is that it's an emotional component, in that there's no rationale why we're compelled to other people, but we're feeling wanting distance from others. Okay. Cognition is one's belief about other persons. This is starting with early childhood, and how we develop our understanding of love by watching, for example, our parents, watching our grandparents, and seeing how they interact with each other, and seeing what, all of them like and dislike. And then we take those on in our life, and we start to develop this idea of what we think the perfect partner would be for us versus others. And I think this is an important point. This is where we develop likes and dislikes. So this is where you get a preference for people with tattoos or no tattoos, people who have education and people who don't, people who are quiet versus people who are loud. It all comes from that creation of a schema that we start early in infancy and develop through early childhood and into adolescence. Okay. And the behaviors are one's tendency to approach or it should say, or avoid other persons. So how we choose to react to that cognition and that primary affect. Okay. So keep these kind of definition situations in mind as we move forward. Okay. We also have to look at some different themes we have to consider. One is biology, genetics, and evolutionary implications. And I think Dr. Fisher well explained the biological aspects of it. And when we get into relationship formation, we'll talk about different areas of the brain that are doing different things. For example, we'll talk about how in the first 2 to 3 years, our brain actually produces something close to amphetamine or methamphetamine, which keeps us in that kind of excited mode, and it gets us moving and motivated, but it also creates that paranoia and all those types of things. And then somewhere around the 3 to 4 year mark, our brain stops producing amphetamine and starts to produce a natural opiate, excuse me, which calms us down and makes us feel more content in our relationships. So we see these natural biological transitions even within relationships, from intense excitement to contentment and partnership. And then, of course, we've talked about, along with Dr. Fisher, kind of the areas of the brain. This is when we're talking about the biology of love and attraction, we always have to remember that it's really close to the bottom of the brain stem. She mentioned the reptilian brain, that these motivations that we have are not always under our control. And so that's important to keep in mind. Social shared norms, culture definitely plays a role. That's why we talk about this in sociology, is that we do need to look at things like social norms, what our culture expects of us, what our community expects of us. If we have time next week, I'll get into interracial relationships, cross-cultural relationships, because while they can be rewarding and they can be life-fulfilling, they also have their own unique challenges because they're going outside of that shared social norm. I think we've seen over the last definitely 20, 25 years, some norms around same-sex relationships changing, right? But imagine how that transition has been for a lot of individuals. And then the last issue that we need to consider when we're talking about attraction is what is called idiosyncratic preferences. Okay, because everything I'm going to present in this presentation, well, it obeys what's called the law of average. Okay, we're going to talk about what the average person is, but there is such variability in the human condition that a lot of these kind of rules or laws that we talk about don't apply to everyone. Okay, and I'll get to some examples of that as we move along. Okay, so what I want to talk about first are 3 basic principles of attraction. The first principle being what's called familiarity. Okay, well, and this is a good example of idiosyncratic. This first statement here is, while there are some people who are attracted to strangers, the majority of people are attracted to those who they are familiar with, they know and have information about. The majority of relationships start with friendships. They start in churches. They start in the workplace. They start in the community, where people are exposed to each other over time. Now, there is again, an idiosyncratic group, a group of individuals who aren't attracted to people who are familiar to them. They're actually attracted to complete strangers. But the idea that birds of the same feather flock together versus opposite attracts, for the vast majority of individuals, it's more of the birds who flock together stay together versus the assumption of opposites attract. And this is kind of the model that we have. We're introduced to a novel person. Hopefully the very first thing we do when we meet anyone new is we want to secure ourselves. We want to have safety. So we kind of check them out, right? And then there's something called the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is just by the mere presence of another person consistently over time, we increase our liking, okay? So for example, if I were to kind of do an experiment in the class and I seated a Confederate who was completely annoying and obnoxious and always was interrupting the class. And I measured liking at the beginning and at the end of the semester. I can almost guarantee that on average, even though the person stayed completely the same and obnoxious throughout the entire class, the liking of the individual will increase over the course of the semester, not decrease. And this is what's called the mere exposure effect, is that just by the mere continued presence of someone, we actually have more liking for them over time. Now, for some people, it might just be a slight half of a fraction of an increase. For others, we see big increases. And as Mark Twain put, familiarity breeds contempt and it breeds children. So that's the principle of familiarity. And then there's the principle of similarity. Okay, and this is the notion that we're attracted to people with similar qualities, and which increases the level and intensity of the relationship. So the principle of similarity, the principle, when we go back here to familiarity, gets us to be engaged with the individual. The principle of similarity is that similarity between each other intensifies that attraction you have with another person. It increases it. So when you find more and more things in common with someone, looks, belief systems, the more intense the feeling of attraction becomes. And then there's the principle of reciprocity, which is we all want to know we are liked and thought well of. Therefore, positive attention leads to greater attention, and we're more likely to reciprocate that back. Okay. However, there are some caveats to this principle. One is, remember the law of operant conditioning. The law of operant conditioning is when a behavior is rewarded, it increases the probability that it'll occur in the future. So, so when you're doing something someone likes, they're going to reward you, which is going to shape your behavior. But there's two other aspects to reciprocity that are really important. Is one, it has to be authentically congruent, and meaning that if you've ever had someone and you don't always have really good mornings, you don't always look great, but every morning they wake up and say, oh, you're so beautiful and wonderful, and you hear that every single morning, eventually you're going to start to question that, and you're going to go, okay, what is their motive behind doing that every single morning when it's not congruent with how I feel? Okay. And also, too much can lead to motive seeking. So a person who constantly is saying, I love you, you're beautiful, all those kind of things, it makes the person lead, okay, what is this person up to? What are they doing? Okay. So there's some caveats to reciprocity. But when it's done correctly, when it's done congruently and authentically, and when it's not overdone, a lot of people who overdo it either do have a motive for doing it, they're doing something wrong, or they're insecure. And those are all things that are become very unattractive in the end. So, but this is really what is this is a principle that really kind of nails a person in with someone. So we have the first principle, which gets us to know each other. The second principle will intensify the more similar we are. This one is the one that really will get us connected and understanding each other. Okay. I do want to talk a little bit about the role of physical appearance, because we do know, There's not many people who wouldn't say that they're not attracted to certain superstars. You know, we always find attraction to beautiful people, those types of things. And the thing that we have to recognize is the difference between who we end up falling in love with and this. This kind of is more in the realm of a stereotype fulfillment, goal fulfillment. In fact, you know, in the machines, when we're looking at intimate love, and we show pictures of really hot guys or really hot women, stereotypically, it's not that area of the brain that starts to fire that is associated with attraction and intimate love. It's actually more the emotional areas that are and cognitive areas that are um, 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 firing. Okay. I'm actually going to put this one to rest. There's research on the idea or the notion that physically attractive people have more success and more wealth and have more abilities to have intimate encounters, and a lot of recent research. In fact, I just need to take this slide out of the presentation. Actually finds there isn't a physical appearance advantage when it comes to attraction and when it comes to intimacy. We find that attractive people fell out just as much as what you would consider stereotypically unattractive people do. So this one is one that needs to be erased from our textbooks. I apologize for even having that one in there. Okay, that one as well. Okay, so there are some universals of attraction. And what I mean by universals of attractions are these are things that we find across cultures. And again, I'm gonna make this point on average. So this isn't everybody, but this is something we consistently find on average across cultures that this is measured in. And when I talk about cross culture, this has even been taken into even some of the Aboriginal cultures in New Guinea, to places in Europe like Germany, of course, here in the United States and South America. And these are kind of the things that we tend to find consistent across cultures. Signs of youthfulness and signs of health. So clear skin, absence of sores. We tend to find that large wide set eyes, as maybe this one's the best example, smaller noses, prominent cheekbones, tend to be a universal attractiveness as far as physical attraction. Okay. Now, again, this is on average across cultures. There's cultural idiosyncratics within each culture. There's some cultures who like more narrowed faces and stuff, but on average, this is what on average we find. Probably one thing that is not on average across cultures, but is pretty consistent across all cultures is what's called the universal of attractiveness, which is facial symmetry. Okay. So if you look at this picture, this is the picture of the actual guy, this one on the left. Okay. And then on the right, we computerly kind of made his face asymmetrical, so you can see his eyebrows are higher than this one. And of course, we ask people to rate this person's attractiveness. And of course, it probably doesn't take much to guess, but picture on the left is rated higher attractiveness than the person on the right. Even though it's the same exact individual, if you base things on personalities about physical features, it's the same personality, it's the same person, but just because of the asymmetry of the face, people will rate one face more attractive than the other. Okay. Now, why is this? There's really been three arguments, but I think the third one probably is the one that gets most close to it. One is the aesthetic argument. We find that when people rate beautiful pictures, beautiful scenery, flowers, and all those, the more symmetrical the picture is, the more symmetrical the flower is, the higher it's rated in beauty and attractiveness. There's also the familiarity argument, where the more asymmetrical the face is, the less it looks like something familiar, something human, okay? But probably the argument I think that makes most sense and has the most evidence for is we have found that the more the asymmetrical the face is, the more developmental issues the person has, the lower their fertility, and they have a slower growth rate and a poor survival rate. Okay, so this is this probably makes a little bit more sense from at least a biological, evolutionary, physiological end. But this is probably one of the laws where averages is more than just averages. It's kind of denoted across individuals. Okay. This one is definitely a law of averages. What do men look for when attracted to females? Again, this is averages across cultures. Look for youthfulness, look for good health, and something we call look for fertility. Okay, and this actually comes to an equation that can be drawn, is what's called the waist to hip ratio. So measurement of the waist, measurement of the hip, and divide the hip into the waist. The closer that ratio becomes to 0.7, the more attractive men find that woman physically. Okay. Now, what this ratio is also associated with, however, is healthy birthing. The closer a woman's hip to a waist ratio is to 0.7, the more likely it will be that they'll have an easy, non-complicated birth. So that's probably the reason behind this one as well, as far as physical attraction is concerned. And that's really what we're talking about right now, is just physical attraction. But again, I will note to this, there has actually been a few recent articles that have been published that challenge this universality. We're finding more and more. For example, research has been done in again, some trying to look for the word, some of our African nations, some more indigenous nations, definitely in the South Pacific area. We're finding this ratio is not necessarily applicable there. So I just want to put that caveat in there, that we are starting to find non-cross-cultural similarities between groups. So this one more obtains probably to more second world, first world types of cultures and societies, and those who more stereotype body frames instead of looking at it from their own cultural, social view. So I just wanted to add that, because there has been some recent articles published on this ratio that has been around for quite a while. So now what about universal attractiveness for women to men? Okay. While we have a list, we find that face, we see, and I find these kind of interesting cues of dominance in the face, deep voices rather than high-pitched voices, and stereotype faces. Now, what do I mean by cues of dominance, and what does the research look like in this kind of thing? This is where we ask women what they want. Do they want a dominant, strong man, or someone who's very masculine, as you would say? Or are they looking for that sensitive guy and the kind person? Okay. And we find that then when we have them go rate pictures of attractiveness of men, both, it doesn't matter where the female is on the gamut of wanting a nice, kind guy versus a dominant, aggressive guy. The majority of women will rate that face with dominance, more on that aggressive side, more of that bravado side, as more attractive than the guys who have personalities that are kind of more that kind type. So that's where that research comes from. I think the deep voice research is interesting as well. There was actually a show done in Europe about this kind of as a comedy type situation. And basically what they did in this situations, and I'll kind of give the TV version because the research version is a little bit boring, is that we took women and we have men with high pitched voices, men with low pitched voices. And we have them memorize a romantic poem or just a poem of some type. And we can bring the females in, and this is of course, a TV show version of this. And there's a curtain, and the man recites the poem, and so the deep voice guy does this really deep voice and deep, okay, and then the high pitch guy kind of gives a poem kind of with that high pitch thing, and then they ask the female, what do you think the man behind the curtain looks like? And of course, with the high pitched guy, they think, oh, he must be physically strong, physically fit. No, the high pitched guy must be a kind of a weakling, probably a little overweight, kind of scrawny, you know, and then the deep voice guy is big and muscular and strong and very physically fit. And then they undo the curtain, and I always find it kind of funny because the pitch of a voice in men is really determined by the testosterone men produce. And larger guys, guys who are plump, tend to produce more testosterone than men who are thin and skinny. No offense to anyone thin or skinny, but guys with high pitched voice tend to produce more estrogen, okay? And estrogen increases the pitch of the voice. And so that tends to be men who are really scrawny and those types of things. Now, there's always differences. Remember, there can be very skinny guys who have very deep voices, and this is on average, okay? And it always surprises people when there's this guy with this nice low voice and whatnot, and they're that, and the other is the skinny, scrawny guy. That's the TV version of it. But for any of the single guys in the room, I think this is a good point to make some advice. If you're worried about your looks and everything else, always start a relationship with a phone call and do it in a nice deep voice. That'll get you started. And then the rest is up to you, but kind of give that a try at first, and I would go from there. Okay. And then just like with females, when we talked about signs of youthfulness and those types of things, we do see some different facial features with men. So this angular face, again, the jotted jaw that we saw with females, and this craggy eye look that we have on James Bond here. These all are signs of physical attractiveness. And if you look at that magazines that put out the, you know, world's most attractive man or America's most attractive man, you'll see that most of them meet this facial criteria of attractiveness. Okay. And then let's go back. The other thing for women, our fads are important, but there needs to be, again, a comment on this. When we talk about women and fads, we're not talking about Paris or New York. We're talking about local fads, whether the individual is dressed according to the current fad that they're in, okay? And so if you go to, for example, where I come from in the rural Northwest, when there's not many people who dress in suits and three-piece suits and ties, it's usually, you know, at the most a polo shirt and some slacks. If a guy goes there with a three-piece suit, he's not going to have very much luck attracting a mate. And just in the similar vein, you know, a person who is dressed in, you know, ready to work the farm, goes to an urban New York, Paris place, probably doesn't have much luck either. So when we talk about fat, we're talking about local fats, what's kind of expected for that community. And then when we dress outside of that, we tend to get either negative attention or no attention at all. We've mentioned visual cues, but there's also probably a really important cue for women, and that's the smell of men. And there is some idiosyncratic differences based on different volumes of the different chemicals in shirts. So this isn't a one fits all, but I'm going to give the easy example of what I mean by smell of men's t-shirts. Is in the first research that they did on this, they took, it was at a college, of course, and so they had, let's say, the men's football team wear a t-shirt during practice, and they got all sweaty in it and all that kind of stuff. And then they had fresh, clean, non-smelling shirts, okay? And then they would put women in these booths, and they'd either be in there, they didn't know, they'd either be in there with the soiled shirt or the freshly laundered shirt. And what we found, again, on average, is that women would rate the same pictures of men more attractive in the smelly shirt room than in the freshly laundered shirt room, okay? And again, the explanation from this goes back to biology. We find that the testosterone is contained in male sweat. And over time, we have found that the more testosterone a male releases, the more their smell, they're found to be attractive regardless of their stereotypical face look. And I think this kind of explains why sometimes you see, you know, why is she with him or he's with her? Well, it's not always about the visual aspects of a person. There's also other sensory aspects of a person, along with our voices and everything else that kind of determine who we're attracted to. Okay. All right. Trying to get through this. All right. So just to kind of summarize some of the stuff that we've been talking about in mate selection, we know mere exposure effect occurs. We tend to marry someone from our neighborhood, school, or back workplace. I know this has probably changed due to globalization and our ability to date someone across the world or across the state lines. But what we find is that even with those relationships that start online, even with those relationships that begin at a distance, mere exposure still plays a role. There's a lot of examples, more subjective examples of people who were very attracted to each other when they were texting each other, doing the online thing with each other, but then when they physically met together, the spark disappeared. And we're seeing that as a more commonplace, but we're finding still the people who we find in our own neighborhood, school, and workplace that spark tends to continue. We tend to marry people who are similar in height, religion, intelligence, personality, and physical attractiveness. This sometimes is hard to see because, you know, there's people who, you know, marry the a-hole in the group. But we have to look beyond emotions when we're working with that. There's more of a distribution on that one. The other thing that we recognize is that in a lot of mate selection, there is also something called fair and equitable distribution of resources, okay? And this is basically, I get what I want out of this and you get what you want out of this, and we find it equal in a sense. And we'll come back to this when we talk about those people who even after 30, 40 years are still madly in love next week. All right. Again, we're talking about universals. What do men and women rate as most important across cultures as far as mates are concerned? Well, this is kind of the list, ranked ordered list. We look for kindness, which makes sense, loyalty. We don't want someone to cheat on us. Emotional stability. Sometimes that's tricky in the beginning when we're trying to act like have it all together. Men, of course, youthfulness and physical appearance. Women, status, resource acquisition, such as education, earning potential, and ambition. And again, I think on a lot of these ends, because I've always been asked by students, listen, I ended up with the biggest loser in the world. And a lot of times when we get talking about it, we talk about at the beginning of the relationship and what kind of things were said. And, very few guys will come up and say, you know what, I'm going to sit on your couch and play video games all day. Maybe a few today, maybe in our modern times that's changed. Or I don't consistently keep a job or something like that. Rarely, I think guys would fess up to that. Most men will go into a dating situation and say, yeah, I'm going to own my own business someday. I'm working towards buying my own, blah, 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 blah. And so up front, this status looks pretty good, but it's not until that later on period where we find differences, okay? There is interesting research because I mentioned in this class, especially at the beginning of the semester, about how women are gaining a lot of power in society. We can see this in our last election, the number of women that were elected to governorships and Senate and Congress. And we're seeing the effects of women in power. And it's kind of interesting because many of the feminists believed, and I'm sure maybe even some males believed, and we'll use this red line to represent women, that as women's power, this represents power on this axis. So we have low power to high power. And that as power increases, the assumption made by a lot of early theorists is that a woman's need for a man with power will decrease. That, it's a resource thing, right? So maybe I don't need that guy who has high power status if I'm the one with that kind of status. But right now it's kind of interesting because what we found is that with power comes the need for a male with even that more power, even exponentially. So a woman in the highest power often needs that man who actually either is perceived or to have more power than they do, which is kind of an interesting thing. I think there's some trends in current research to suggest that this is equaling out, that this effect isn't as large as it once was in the research. But we'll have to watch that one. But this is the current results, but we're seeing that change as well. So we also know that there's gender differences in mate selection as far as willingness to get into long-term relationships. And I think this, from a view from studying both sexuality and mate selection, I think this is a result of us getting our sex drive confused with our mating drive, with our mate drive, with our intimate love drive. Okay. Because when we look at sexuality, men have an advantage according to evolution to spread their seed as much as they can, and women have a commitment because they're having that child. That child is developing inside of them, and there's going to be this commitment to that infant. And so what we found is that men tend to be more interested in several short-term intense relationships, where women are looking for fewer relationships over the lifespan. I should note this, that, you know, sexuality and human intimacy, while we confuse the two socially and sometimes cognitively, from a brain perspective, they are two separate things. Indeed, the intimate love drive goes along the right track of the brain, and the sex drive goes along the left track of the brain. They're two separate areas of the brain that are being reacted when we're seeking out sexuality versus seeking out intimacy or an intimate partner. And so, but I think sometimes there's a cultural effect of combining the two. I'd also like to mention a kind of an interesting kind of looking at the different preferences between men and women, the Hawaii experiment. In this experiment, Confederates, these are individuals who are working for the researcher, randomly go up to strangers and they ask one of two questions. They will either ask, would you have sex with me? Or would you go on a date with me? Okay, and remember, these are random strangers. And what we found is when we originally did this research, that 70% of men said yes. 0% of women said yes. In fact, what we found is those men who said no actually apologized and kind of made an excuse, saying that they were either married or they were already involved. They would if they could, but they couldn't, is basically the result. Women often responded with outrage and disgust, regardless of, and just so you know, the Confederates that were selected had what we call an average attractiveness. Their ratings were average, so they weren't non-attractive individuals, but they weren't the, you know, the superstars, as you would say, or the tens, I think is the word I've heard. But what about, would you go on a date with me? This one is the one I think is interesting. Women were like, okay, so 50%, so 50% of women, coin toss, would say, yeah, sure, I would do that. The thing that interests me is for men, it goes from 70% down to 50% or 53%. And so this kind of, in a way, expounds on other research that we found that men tend to have differences in what they're seeking when they're looking at even strangers in a strange situation like this one. So, so there's that. And so what do we find when we come to long-term relationships? So you've selected the major, and we do find that there's some gender differences in this. We find that men kind of do a calculation about whether they're going to stay in a long-term relationship versus doing the benefits of having multiple encounters. They do this calculation and they decide whether the quality of the relationship outweighs the benefits of having multiple encounters with other women. And if it goes below that quality, we find men will seek out other advantages. Okay. We find that wealthy men are more likely to engage in what's called serial relationships, or basically cheating behavior. So this is the stereotype of the wealthy man who has a wife at home and the secretary at work, stereotype again. But we do find that there is an association between male wealth and their willingness to engage in cheating behavior. We find that men are more likely to engage, and this is, again, I think another issue for social and our sociology issue, is men are more likely to engage in long-term relationships if they are perceived as, if their partner is perceived as having premarital chastity on part of the female. So having less sexual partners before the man tends to make the man want to engage more in a long-term relationship. I think, again, this is probably a cultural issue. I haven't seen much research done on other cultures except for here in the United States. But I think this one we can cash up to culture and definitely our views of the the biases we have between men and women. I want to see. Okay, I'm gonna skip that one. All right. I haven't included the Daniela, the studies of previous generations. So what studies we do have is it kind of fits that same line, right? So this is kind of a cultural thing, right? Is you know, before in traditional relationships, the female was expected to remain chastised, right? And so I do think that we're seeing a cultural aspect to this. What I would be interested in is seeing what it looks like today. Now that we have, as you mentioned, the apps and those to contact several different individuals and have different opportunities. Now, the interesting thing that I think is about cheating behavior that hasn't been put in these slides is who will men and women engage in cheating behavior with? And it really has to do with the individual's primary partner. And what we find is that women will engage in cheating. I thought this was in here. Oh, it is right here. Ignore this. This is another thing that's been debunked. Okay. We have it for women. When will people engage in what are called extra pair copulations? This means cheating, basically. We find that both males and females will engage in cheating behavior across culture. Men definitely do it a lot more than women. I think it's like a 1-to-4 ratio, something like that. But when are women motivated to, we've talked about when men are, so if they find dissatisfaction, the quality of their relationship less. We can go back to this slide. We know that the more wealth a male has, they'll more likely engage in cheating behavior if they find the quality is less than what the benefit would be. If you know, if they engage in their mates, you know, premarital chastity, quote unquote. So we know that men will engage in extra pair copulation with this, as that word is said. Women tend to be motivated when dissatisfied with the current relationship and or gifts and status are received from an extra person. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about cheating behavior that I think is that the tendency for who a male or a female chooses to engage in cheating behavior with is that we find that, again, this is on average, but it kind of fits the mold most of the time. Males will cheat with women who are 2 social statuses below their current partner. Okay, I want to repeat that. Men will cheat on a woman when their primary female, the person they're going to cheat with, are 2 social statuses below their current partner. Women, on the other hand, for the majority, cheat with men who are 2 social statuses above their current male partner. So men go down, women go up. Kind of an interesting side note on cheating behavior. Now, again, I've gone through this, and there's some things that we don't know. Globalization, the internet, instant communication, increase of power in women, resources that partners bring to a relationship. And so there are some questions that we have to ask today, and whether these different things are impacting what we have seen traditionally over the last 50, 60, 70 years of doing research on this issue. So I think we'll see some changes in this research in our more modern society, especially with the more openness, the power of women coming out, finding the status of the male within the family systems, and all those things that we talked about dealing with gender issues and whatnot earlier in the semester. I think we'll find some differences or some changes. And I've always been asked, what about same-sex relationships or same-sex attraction? And I think I brought this up when we talked about gender, is if you're interested in looking at same-sex and bisexual, two-spirited relationships, I wouldn't look at any research before about 2012, because before 2012, the research tended to be funded by special interest groups who had one view or another, either a positive or a negative view. It wasn't until about 2011, 2012 that the federal government actually released funds for scientists who want to do unbiased research to do research on LGBTQ communities. Okay. But what we have found so far, with same-sex attraction and those types of things, is the patterns are the same. We find even down to the shirt smell experiments with females, down to the signs of youthfulness with gay men. We find these same trends. Women will cheat on a female companion with two statuses above. We find that men in same-sex relationships will cheat with two statuses below their male partner. And so far, we haven't seen any differences between same-sex relationships and heterosexual relationships. So that's the status, if anyone was curious, because I know I've been talking mostly male-female relationships, but that is kind of where we are with same-sex relationships. So I'm going to stop sharing, and let's talk a little bit about we're going to start next week with a video to kind of give some highlights on some sociological experiments, and I want to save them for next week because it's a good start to get into, relationship development, formation, and family, and the like, about what happens when two people are really falling for each other and really engage with each other. And I'll just kind of give a highlight. So yeah, yes, there's sociologists and psychologists who show up to bars and to popular dating places. And yes, we watch people. Okay, it's a public place, it's public domain, so we're allowed to. And we watch people and we watch what they do. And it's kind of interesting if you're ever bored, or want something to do, go or if you're on a date with your partner and it's, you're kind of bored, do this with your partner, is watch people who you think are on their first date. And you'll actually be able to predict whether or not that relationship is going to last very long or not. Because what you'll notice is in the beginning of the date is that they're very idiosyncratic. They're doing their own things. They're putting their napkins where they want it. They'll put their forks and knives where they want it. But as the night goes on, you'll notice something, especially with two people who really look like they're into each other, is that they'll start parroting each other. You'll notice that their legs are pointed towards each other. You'll notice that their forks and knives are on the same places. You'll notice that their drinks are placed in the same place. That when one reaches for the drink, the other one will reach for the drink. You'll notice that when they attend to something, they both will move in the same motion. In essence, they become synchronous with each other. And it's really kind of cool to watch if anyone's ever bored. And when we think of the things like the basis of dance, when we think of the basis of the things of why people go to meet people where there's music and there's rhythm, and there's places where people are doing the same thing, we're finding that maybe this is the basis for dancing. This is the basis for going to somewhere that has a lot of music, is because it makes it so two individuals will become in sync with each other and they'll become one, as they said. But we'll watch a short video on that next week. I just think it's really cool to watch if anybody's bored. But this is kind of where we'll leave it for this week. Does anybody have any questions?
No.
Thank you, Taylor. All right. Well, let's leave this mate selection and attraction perspective right here. Next week, we will pick up on development of the complete intimate relationship where two people become completely integrated with each other. And then we develop a family and we develop a community, which I think would be a good way to start our Thanksgiving week with. So we'll do that next week. So unless there's any questions, have a wonderful night. Again, the assignment for tonight is just to post your notes from tonight. If you do handwritten ones, just take a picture of them, submit them, and you're good to go. If you've typed them, just send them. You can copy and paste into the chat thingy on the thing, or you can upload a Word document or whatever. But that's the assignment for this week. And so until next week, everybody have a beautiful week, have a successful week, and we will see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.